Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyid al-Mursaleen. What a thrill to stand here. As this KKESH was a source of our training many years ago for most of us that are here, and as I look at these young, eager faces, I know that it is a source of training for these young residents and fellows. As you all know, and this is more really to our speaker, KKESH is our pride and joy. It was and will be again the leader of eye care, not only in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, but also the neighboring countries under the new leadership. Dr. Sosa Nawalati, thank you for giving me the privilege to moderate this session and come back home again to King Khalid Eye Specialist Hospital. Now to our guest speaker. Dr. Rizzo is originally from New Orleans, and I think most of us know New Orleans from the American Academy of Ophthalmology venue that we've gone to so many a times. He is board certified ophthalmologist and neurologist and has been the director of the Neuro-Ophthalmology Service at the Harvard Medical School in Boston for the last 12 years. Dr. Rizzo has received numerous awards, which I cannot go through, and honors, given numerous research presentations and seminars, invited lecturer with numerous publications, over 170, and vastly involved in teaching. He's at the moment writing a 5-volume book on neuro-ophthalmology. Dr. Rizzo is a clinical scientist and devotes 50% of his time to seeing patients and the other half to research. He currently holds 3 federal grants to develop the visual prosthetic devices. He also co-founded the Boston Retinal Implant project for the last 30 years. And this has been a collaboration between the Harvard Medical School and the MIT, which we all know and have heard a lot about, with the goal of restoring vision to the blind, which is the subject of his talk today. It gives me both the pleasure and honor to present Dr. Joseph Rizzo to give the weekly joint academic ophthalmology meeting ground rounds at King Khalid Eye Specialist Hospital on why a visual prosthesis has the potential to improve visual function for patients with retinitis pigmentosa. Joe.
Thank you very much. This is something of a dream for me to be here. I've never been to Saudi Arabia before, and I've known about KKESH for many, many decades. In fact, a close friend of mine was here, Dr. Michael Wagner, and we are good friends, are in touch regularly, and so I knew a lot about this hospital, but never had a chance to actually be here. So it's a real honor for me to present my work to you and to share my vision with you of what I think is now possible because of advanced technology. So before I start, I just want to let you know that I do have some potential conflicts of interest, which is that I have ownership and intellectual property in companies known as Bionic Eye and Visus, and I also am a medical advisor to Magic Leap, and I will be speaking about some aspects of that technology with respect to this program. So this is the big picture. All right, I'm a clinician scientist. As a neuro-ophthalmologist, I wanted to become expert at making diagnoses of blinding conditions, but I also wanted to help those blind patients see. And my approach was to use advanced technology toward the goal of rehabilitation and ultimately toward the goal of improved quality of life, and in particular, to help patients who are blind attain and maintain employment. There's an interesting history behind the visual prosthetic programs. So what one might call phase 1 actually began in the 1950s up to the 1990s. This was developed by neurosurgeons who were going onto the surface of the brain and doing electrical stimulation of different parts of the brain and demonstrating conclusively that certain gyri in the brain controlled certain functions. they began to map out the brain in this way, and the natural extension of that was that it would be possible to stimulate certain areas of the brain to restore function, like vision. Notable names are Brindley and Dobell, Penfield, you probably have heard about. What we consider to be the modern phase of visual prosthetic research began in the late 1980s. So I co-founded the field of retinal prosthetics, but together with Mark Humayun and Jean Dewan. And it was very interesting because their group based in North Carolina and my group based at Harvard and MIT had roughly the same idea at the same time. We both began independent projects and really co-founded this field that exploded with technology in the future decades, which I'll share with you in a minute. And now phase 3, what we're in now, is that groups around the world, and there are more than 20, now have devices that are epiretinal, subretinal, suprachoroidal, optic nerve, lateral geniculate, visual cortex, the full spectrum of afferent visual pathways being explored as a potential prosthesis. And of course, there have been certain companies that have been successful in obtaining regulatory approval and commercialization, including, of course, Second Sight, which has been a leader in this. So all around the world, there are groups emerging from this co-founding opportunity 30 years ago. And so there's a huge critical mass of researchers around the world that all basically have the same goal. And I'm not only very fortunate to be a part of this large group, but I'm also a real champion of this field. But before we think about using advanced technology, which is both expensive and it's a risk to implant these devices, right? They're implants. Before we think about that, let's just reflect on what can be done without an implant. I told my group for years, I said, whatever we do, we have to do better than a white cane, right? Because it's inexpensive, there's no risk in using it, you know. We can't have a very expensive implant that takes 30 years to develop and not help someone do something more than they can do with a white cane. And of course, there are advanced vision rehabilitation strategies, sensory substitution devices, computer-assisted strategies. We have stem cells, gene therapy, which is, I think, I'm a big fan of that as well, and optogenetics emerging. Each one of these fields holds promise. In fact, it may be that some of these fields are better in treating certain forms of blindness than others. So in any field of research, you want to have a broad portfolio, and then ultimately you have to see which works best. But all of these are happening, and in a sense, they're all competitive with visual prosthetic devices, right? I don't view them as being competitive. I think we're all have the same goal of helping patients who are visually impaired. But nonetheless, they're interesting technologies. So why did I choose a prosthetic approach? I began by doing retinal transplantation. I began with a biological approach. I decided after many years that that wasn't likely to be successful in my lifetime, professional lifetime. I thought that an engineered solution was better. And it was better in my mind, doesn't mean it's correct, because with the prosthesis, you're taking advantage of pathways that were developed appropriately early in life, but are no longer being used. You don't have to create pathways. They're sitting there, just not being used. Now, with genetic strategies, again, which I am a big fan of this, and I think it will play a major role in what we do in the future. But for each genetic mutation, so for retinitis pigmentosa, there are well over 100. For each one, you'd have to develop the viral vector approach and demonstrate its safety before you'd be allowed to use it. So it will work, I believe it, but it's a Herculean task to think about doing this for all of the genetic abnormalities. With biological strategies like stem cells, the challenge there is you can surely implant them and they will connect to nerve tissue. But those cells have to connect in some logical fashion in very large numbers to communicate effectively to the brain. So it's not just about stem cells surviving. They have to form a structured pathway to send information from the eye to the brain. It was my view that that wasn't going to happen in my professional lifetime. It's beyond what we understand biologically. Well, anyway, these are all theories. Ultimately, they have to be proven, but that's the approach that I took. When I co-founded the project, the Boston Retinal Implant Project in the late 1980s. So, you know, every person, every group has its own personality and philosophy. So I decided that we should take an extremely long-term view of what we needed. I took the position that restoring vision was going to be a hugely difficult task and maybe never successful, but that we had to have a strategy based upon science for what we thought we would need in terms of hardware. What do we need to build to make it likely that someone could do something to improve their quality of life? So one of the first things we did was to learn how to use microfabrication technology that's used for silicon chips in plastic. So we were able to use standard microfabrication facilities to lay wires and electrodes, metal electrodes, in ultra-thin plastic, 12 microns thick, so much thinner than a human hair. And we were the first to use that type of microfabricated array in humans as proof of concept experiments that we did maybe 20 years ago. So what motivated us to do this prosthetic field? Well, the obvious, millions of people worldwide who are blind and severely blind without treatment. Secondly, we all know of the tremendous benefits that cochlear prosthetics have provided to deaf patients. Right? Now that field took 30 plus years to develop, but now patients who are completely deaf can often hear well enough to carry on a telephone conversation where they can't use lip reading. Right? It's a stunning success. Now the visual system is much more complicated physiologically. We're not going to have that kind of success, I think, as quickly. But I think ultimately we could be as successful in the visual world. Advances in microtechnology. We've been able to leverage the industry that's being developed for the computer field. We don't have to develop that technology. It's being developed for us, and we get to leverage it. So the idea of developing ultra-small, sophisticated electronics that would fit into the eye was only a pipe dream in the 1970s. The technology wasn't there to do it. When I started our program in the late 1980s, it was just beginning to be developed. And now, of course, we have nanotechnology that really makes it possible. I also mentioned the earlier challenges with the biological approach, so that again motivated me to shift from a biological approach to an engineered approach. So let's just make sure we all understand how a prosthetic works, at least a visual prosthetic, at least one based in the eye. So, of course, the retina lines the back of the eye. If we take a section of that retina and look at it here, with this being the inner retinal surface where light comes in, normally light comes in and goes to the photoreceptors, which generate a neural signal that passes then to many other neurons, ultimately to the retinal ganglion cells, whose axons form the optic nerve that deliver visual information to the brain. So each human retina, by the way, has about 150 million nerve cells, roughly 50 different cell types, an incredibly complex neuroanatomical, neurophysiological organization. But as you know, the most common causes of neural blindness are degenerations of the outer retina, with age-related macular degeneration being most common in the United States, for instance, but retinitis pigmentosa being the most common cause of inherited blindness in the world. In both of those conditions, the fundamental problem is a loss of the photoreceptors and patients become blind. But one could put an implant under the retina or perhaps on the epiretinal side, we've done both, and stimulate the remaining nerve cells to carry information to the brain. So we don't have to build neural pathways. They're sitting there, no longer getting their input. So a way of thinking about this, if you were going to develop a project like this, how would you do it? You know, where do you start? And of course, where you should start is with the patient. What type of function are you going to try to give to a patient? If you say navigation, that's fine, but remember, it has to be better than a cane, right? Nowadays, if you say reading with a prosthesis, I would say, I don't think they need that, right? We have voice recognition software that reads to blind patients. That does a really good job. So you have to know what your goals are. And I do think that the most important goal is safe navigation in an unfamiliar area without assistance. In other words, if I wanted to walk out of this room on my own without running into people or objects and not asking for assistance, that would change my life. And you see, we could do it a lot better than a cane, because with a cane, you can detect if there's an object directly in front of you, but there's no way to get a heading of whether you're going in the right direction. With electronics, we can guide people and give them the heading, right? We have a real potential advantage in being able to do that. Now, there's something that I call intermediate vision, which is what we do most of the time. The activities that we use with our hands. Cooking, grooming, cleaning, whatever we do around our desk and around our home, these are intermediate tasks, which, by the way, I include social interactions. If I'm talking to someone, I would like to be able to see their face. I'd like to be able to know whether they're smiling at me or not even paying attention to me. That social connectedness is part of what I would consider intermediate level vision. And then ultimately, central vision or reading. So because I think the latter is not as relevant for prosthetics at this time, what we're really left with is peripheral vision or intermediate. And there's no sense thinking about intermediate until you can get peripheral, right? So if you were going to design one of these devices, what you really should be aiming for is the ability to navigate safely. Now I'm going to take you through how we've done it, but let's just reflect on the challenges, because there have been many. When I co-founded this project at MIT with Professor John Wyatt, he was very curious about it, and we went out to dinner. That's how we began the project. We had a very long dinner, and he's an engineer, and he took out a piece of paper. He goes, let's think of what the problems are likely to be. Let's just, brainstorm this. And we both felt overwhelmingly that the issue would be biocompatibility. We were thinking of putting a foreign object, a complex foreign object, into the eye. It just seemed natural that there'd be an inflammatory chronic reaction that would encapsulate the device. Real-world image transformation. So if you took a picture of this room right now, right, the cameras provide beautiful images, tens of thousands of pixels. So you basically have to take this detailed world and convert those images to deliver through a small number of electrodes. So you need some digital processing to transform the image of the world, capturing the information that's going to be most relevant to the patient and turning that into a digital signal. Hermeticity. Microelectronics cannot survive in any salt water. So the body is filled with salt water. So on the one hand, you have to build electronics to survive in the saltwater environment, but you have to encapsulate it. The problem is you have to emerge from that hermetic encapsulation to reach the neural tissue. And that point of egress from the hermetic encapsulant zone has been the major technical limitation in the field of neural implants, not just visual. That's been the major gap. Well, even if you can do that, let's say you can build a device and it's biocompatible and it survives the salt water, you have to have some way of stimulating nerve tissue in a predictable way to produce a predictable outcome. In other words, you have to know how to communicate with the brain to emulate normal vision. And of course, we don't know how to do that. Now, we've spent decades doing in vitro retinal physiology to try to learn how to do it, but fundamentally, we're trying to emulate the neural code for vision, which no one knows. So I'm going to take a big leap forward. So this collective body of research across the field, what has been achieved so far? Well, in some respects, a lot. So I want you to think about this list with respect to the fact that the patients whom we're going to implant initially have essentially no vision, right? So it turns out that even after decades of having essentially no vision, patients can readily see phosphenes, which means spots of light, and you can vary what they see by adjusting the stimulus. A higher stimulus, a high frequency stimulus, a faster stimulus. Each one of these, in fact, changes what people see. So it gives you a toolbox of strategies that you can use to influence what people see. And people have been able to detect movement, the orientation of lines, objects on a table, and even being able to follow a path. That's pretty good. If you consider the fact that these patients had essentially no vision, that's already a significant step forward. Now, in terms of visual acuity, which is the measure that we naturally all think about, the best measures that have been obtained, and this is from two companies, Retina Implant AG in Tübingen, Germany, and Second Sight in California. Both of those companies deserve a lot of credit for pushing the field forward, getting into human implants, and collecting the kind of data that I'm going to tell you about. So those two companies have reported in their best patients visual acuity between our notations, 20/500 and 20/1000. So of course, these are very large letters, with legal blindness being 2200. Well, that's pretty good. I mean, it's not as good as I would like it to be, but it's pretty good, you would think. The problem is that, at least for the Second Sight device, on average, it's required about 40 seconds for the patients to recognize a single letter. So I do think that is still a significant outcome, but it isn't an outcome that is yet practical, right? If you're trying to read words, right, that's just not going to work. So, and everyone in the field recognizes this. I'm not being critical of the field. I'm a champion of the field. But the question is, how do we get from where we are to where we want to be? And that's what I'd like to focus on as we go forward. And there are a lot of bright spots that, you know, after 30 years continues to give me momentum, and fortunately continues to give momentum to the funding agencies to keep the work going. But the biocompatibility issue that I raised earlier has not been an issue. It is amazing. All these companies, all these research teams using different materials, different locations, different designs, by and large, all of them have been biocompatible. It's just great and unexpected. The continuous improvement in technology certainly gives us a lot of hope. Again, we don't have to spend the money to develop it. It's being developed for us. What we need to do is to customize it. There has been a gradual improvement in our understanding of how to stimulate the neural tissue. Our group has contributed to that a lot. The group at Stanford, the group at Tübingen, Germany, the Second Sight group. So we're all together getting a better handle on how to do this. The increasing number of implants has also provided a huge benefit. So there's no question but that they can be implanted safely. We're learning more and more about what patients can and cannot see. And the regulatory agencies, both in Europe and the United States, have admitted that they're on a learning curve also. They have actually been partners in this, and they are much more well-informed, which is a benefit not only to us, but to the patients. And I'd like to mention this is another sort of unexpected aspect. So the difference between visual function, like acuity, and functional vision. Functional vision meaning, well, what can I do with whatever level of vision that I have? So that's become a mainstay of the visual rehabilitation field. Not focusing on a number, but what can a person actually achieve? So it turns out that this has become a requirement by the FDA to seek approval. And what patients say might surprise you, that even patients who have not benefited in any objective way sometimes report that they still like the device, because they would report, my eyes felt dead, but now they feel alive. And so purely on a psychological, emotional grounds, they feel better. And that's not true for all patients. But I think as a sighted person, that's not something you would think would be meaningful. But I think it is very meaningful. Our job is to make that vision better. So what's holding the field back? Well, there's actually a very long list of things. Let me just tell you before I get too far into this that this topic of retinal remodeling is kind of interesting. So no one knew what retinal remodeling was until the field of visual prosthetics began. And a researcher by the name of Robert Mark, M-A-R-C, at the University of Utah, discovered a fundamental principle in the nervous system that's now recognized throughout the brain, not just in the eye. The long story made short is that when cells lose their afferent input, they don't just sit by idly. They want to find afferent input. And they develop lots of pathologies to look for input. So in the retina, what happens is that normally the only cells that would express opsins are in the photoreceptors, other than a small number of so-called melanopsin retinal ganglion cells. All the other neurons, the tens of millions of neurons, don't express opsins. They can't convert light into a nerve signal. But when they lose their photoreceptors, many of them do. They begin to express opsin and extend their dendrites anywhere they can to look for input. A very high density of microneuromas form among these neurons. Cells that would normally never talk together are now talking together, which is a nightmare if you think about trying to stimulate the retina to create vision, right? Now we have pathways that are interconnected that normally wouldn't be the case. So anyway, one limitation to the field could purely be biological. In other words, it doesn't matter how good the devices are going to be. We may have a limit on what we can achieve. Now, that sounds like a disaster. I'll tell you how we're dealing with that. But I think it's a relevant factor, and we don't yet know the extent to which it will limit our outcomes. But let's think about what we can do. What steps can we take that are positive? Well, you need to have more electrodes. I mean, clearly, if you're going to get a sense of the spatial layout of this room, you're going to need a larger number of electrodes. And if you use large electrodes to deliver electricity into the retina, you're going to be stimulating wide areas of the retina when you do that. And so therefore, you're going to have a very coarse image. Ideally, you would like more electrodes, and you'd like them to be much smaller. Furthermore, if you stimulate on either the epiretinal or the subretinal surface, you're still pretty far from the nerve cells, at least 30, if not 50 microns, which in terms of physiology is a very long distance. You'd like to have your electrodes in the retina, though it sounds implausible. So let's look at this beautiful Monet impressionistic painting, right? So here you can see that even if you only had coarse pixels, you can still have a beautiful image of the world. In other words, it's not necessarily true that you need a lot of electrodes, but you have to know what to do with them. But there is a constant chatter among the research field. Everyone, if you go 60, 200, 500, 1,000, 10,000, everyone wants more numbers. Sure. Well, look, this is a so-called pointillist painting by Seurat, right? There are many thousands of pixels here. It doesn't look nearly as good. Why? Because there's not as much color contrast. So I show you these pictures to say it's not just the number of electrodes. It's your ability to deliver the electrical stimulation in a way that's advantageous to control the neural output of the retina. Remember, half of the neural output of the retina are on cells that become more active when there's light. The other half are off cells. The same is true for all the color-sensitive cells. So you have to learn how to stimulate in a way that creates contrast, both black and white and color, to get high-resolution images. We don't know how to do that, but we need to learn. Okay, so that's all conceptual. Now, what if you say, you know what, it's time to get to work. Let's build something. What do you need to make it work? You need some device to capture the images for people who are blind. You can do that with a camera, or you can do it with photodiode arrays. Both are completely plausible and equally good. The implant needs power. You can deliver that power with radio frequency or infrared light. Both are equally good. You need to have some strategy for delivering this pixelated information to the retina. In other words, you have to have the ability to individually address the electrodes to decide which electrodes get lots of current or not as much, high frequency, low frequency, and all of that has to be done in real time based upon what the pictures are being taken by the camera. And lastly, of course, you need the hardware to do all of this. So those are the four big categories. So let me tell you about our program, the Boston Retinal Implant Project. So our prosthetic system has two components, an external component, or a pair of glasses, shown here schematically. And that device needs to have a camera, which is shown here. That's going to take the pictures. To transfer those images, you have to be connected to some kind of processing device like a phone. So there'd be a wire going down the sidebar connected to a phone. Of course, you could do Bluetooth if you wanted to ultimately, but right now hardwired is fine. The image becomes processed. It gets sent back to the pair of glasses, and this brown rim represents a primary radio frequency coil that communicates with a smaller secondary coil that's implanted on the eye. So the primary and the secondary coil communicate bidirectionally. We can send information in, and from every electrode in real time, we can know its behavior because there's also reverse transmission of wireless communication. By the way, you wouldn't see this device when it's implanted on a human. This is just schematically. So now let's look at the device itself. So I told you we took a very long time to scale up the number of electrodes. Well, part of that is you're going to need a lot more power. So if you put a coil on the side of the eye, you have a pretty significant limitation in terms of how much power you can deliver. The amount of power you can deliver by radio frequency depends substantially upon the diameter of the coil and how many turns there are in the coil. So we worked for many years to figure out how to implant these gold coils in the front of the eye, which was more challenging because it's lying, this is metal, lying directly underneath the conjunctiva. And so there'd be a risk of extrusion, particularly because the lids go up and down, right? So we had to learn how to build the device, how to coat the device, how to do the surgery. And we've been able to do that successfully for many, many years now. But once you get the power and the visual detail to the secondary coil, it then has to go into a hermetic enclosure wherein you have your application-specific computer chip that receives and distributes the power and the visual signal to each of the electrodes. But then you have to get from that computer chip to the retina. So we do this by having an ultra-thin plastic, the 12-micron thick plastic, which we insert through a single slit posteriorly and under the retina. I'll show you some pictures in a moment. So essentially, this entire device is outside of the eye. This is one of the reasons why it's very biocompatible. We only put a small, maybe 7 millimeters of 12-micron thick polyimide into the eye. So this is how we do it. We go around to the back of the eye. We make a scleral flap, which you can see here. Then you're faced with the choroid and the uvea, of course, the pigmented uvea. Getting through the choriocapillaris is non-trivial because of its tendency to bleed. It took a long time to learn how to do that, but we can do it. So then we want to focus on the retina. We do a core vitrectomy initially. Then we raise a retinal bleb so that the retina gets out of harm's way. And that's the region within which we want to implant the electrode array, which we do by inserting under the scleral flap, under the retina. And when we go through the choroid, the fluid that we had used to raise the bleb leaks out. And then the retina comes down upon the electrode array. So let's look at the function. This was the first such device we made many, many years ago. The whole thing was made on this 12-micron thick polyimide. So we made a device that was completely flexible, that we could suture around the eye. You could see the suture loops. It had its secondary coils, the custom-designed computer chips, and we were able to deliver power and data, which then went to the computer chips, which then delivered a signal to the electrode array. Back then, that was our first device, which was only 16 electrodes. That was probably 20 years ago. And that's what it looked like. What this did, though, is it allowed us to develop the techniques for microfabrication, demonstrate that we can implant it safely and that it actually functioned. But this is what it looks like now. So this is the secondary coil in the front of the eye, the hermetic enclosure, and the connecting cable that goes behind the eye. So it turns out that, of course, the eye socket is filled with fat. It's very tolerant of putting a device on the back side of the eye. It seems not to be a problem at all. And we use these suture loops on the metal to secure it in place. So let me just give you an idea. This is, so we moved from the epiretinal side to the subretinal side because after 10 years of working on the epiretinal side, I decided that it just wasn't going to work. There wasn't going to be a way to conformally align the electrode array on the retinal surface. If you're only separated by 50 microns from the retina. Only 50 microns, less than the width of the hair. You increase the stimulation thresholds fourfold. 50 microns is, you know, if you're doing surgery, you don't see that. It's hard to see 50 microns. So we wanted to be in complete contact with the retina over a wide area, which is a real challenge. So let me show you how extreme we've pushed it. So if you want someone to navigate safely through an unfamiliar area, you'd like to give them a fairly wide field of view, right? If you have a very small field of view, you're constantly having to search. So we made this 5 mm diameter electrode array. This one happens to have 100 electrodes. You can see the round electrodes, each one hardwired to the computer chip. So this device, theoretically, if we put it in humans, would allow us to provide more than 20 degrees of visual field. It's huge. Now, there would be no way of securing this on the epiretinal surface, right? Because you'd have to have tacks or glues all the way around. It's just not practical. But boy, on the subretinal side, here you see it implanted in a pig. So we're looking through a dilated pupil of a pig 3 months after surgery. You can see the retinal blood vessels. And here's that electrode array sitting under the retina without any obvious scarring of the retina. So we did this multiple times and published on this. So the point is, there are many advantages to being in the subretinal space. One of them is that the ability to conformally align the electrode array. The second is that we can implant the large electrode array. Our group has, at least in our view, 3 perhaps strategic advantages that we feel most proud of. And I'm going to share with you, I think, one of the most important right now. So here you're looking at an electrode array 3 months after implantation in a pig. Each white spot represents a penetrating electrode. We learned how to microfabricate 3-dimensional electrodes. So this electrode here, on your left, is 70 microns tall, only 10 microns across. It is coated by an insulating material so that the electricity only emerges from the post, the top of the post. So learning how to make microfabricated electrodes that were electrified was a challenge unto itself. But the bigger challenge that we feared is